Inciters, and no dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials, and the Millennial. Joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer on the other side of the camera. Welcome, everyone, to this podcast. The podcast is titled The Inciters, like inciting a riot and inciting people to do things that they otherwise would never think of doing. Why are we talking about this podcast? Well, we actually have a really interesting group of clips for you to listen to and stories that I think will build the case for the fact and the thesis that I have, which is the Democrat Party in the United States of America intends to incite the conservatives and Republicans across the nation to riot, kind of like their people do, like Antifa, and like people do on a regular basis in the neighborhoods of the inner cities of America, where they go and they loot and they burn and they steal and they riot. Well, for some reason, that's okay, according to the Democrats and the mainstream media. So what the Democrats are trying to do is to win an election by saying that the real danger in America are those individuals who are obviously the fascists and semi-fascists and the MAGA Republicans. We talked about this briefly the other podcast, but this podcast, we have some new stories to add credibility to my thesis that the Democrat Party intends to incite Republicans across the nation to rioting and to civil disobedience. So first up, here is part of the building of that thesis. The governor of New York calls for a Republican purge. Kathy Hochul, she's the governor of New York. She calls for 5.4 million of New York's registered Republicans to leave the state. She basically says in a speech, they need to leave. They need to go. They must, we must purge them, get rid of them. So in the New York Post, Governor Kathy Hochul, who hasn't proven shy about issuing orders, had one for the state's Republicans. All 5.4 million of the Republicans, quote, just jump on a bus, she said, and head down to Florida where you belong, okay? Question mark. You are not New Yorkers, she says. Folks, this is the governor of New York. She's saying to the 5.4 million individuals who happen to be registered Republican in the state of New York that they're not New Yorkers, they must go, that they must leave the state. Kind of like what the Russians are doing to the Ukraine. Hey, you need to leave the country because it's our country now. If you don't like it, if you don't like what we're doing here, then you need to go, or else. It's the same kind of order and edict that you're seeing in authoritarian countries across the world. And yet, this is the Democrat Party that is doing that. And so I ask you the question, as part of my support of the thesis that I had at the beginning of this podcast, namely that Democrats are trying to incite Republicans and conservatives into civil disobedience and riots, and potentially armed conflict, which obviously is wrong for the Democrats to do that. So part of the thesis is, you heard this story, the governor of New York saying, hey, every Republican in the state, leave the state and go to Florida where you belong. So the article continues, if you can move beyond the frankly disgusting political partisanship and intolerance that the governor of New York's message is fiscally responsible and even dangerous. The governor probably already knows this, but the state's extensive public sector, because New York has a really large welfare state, which the paper is calling the public sector, is heavily reliant on personal income taxes paid by residents. Most of them are probably Republicans. And with nearly $14 billion in projected budget gaps over the next 5 years, New York can't afford to lose any more taxpayers, let alone the 5.4 million Republicans that she's trying to get rid of, which are probably the people that are actually, working and paying taxes. The Empire State, as New York is known, has already lost 5 million residents in the past 10 years alone. And there's no sign of that trend letting up. In fact, more than 350,000 New Yorkers relocated during the 12 pandemic-plagued months leading up to July 1, 2021. In her attempt to be snappy, Hochul exposed a major problem that has gripped our state since the dawn of the Cuomo-Hochul era. New Yorkers are leaving, and they're taking their tax dollars with them. Hochul should be doing everything she can to encourage people to stay. But she hasn't, and her record $220 billion budget suggests she has no interest in ever letting taxpayers off of the heavy hook. New York City residents pay the highest combined state and local personal income tax in the United States. Those high taxes and other factors have led to a mass exodus of jobs and job creators. The Big Apple is yet to recover its pre-pandemic employment levels, coming in roughly 300,000 jobs below February 2020 mark as of July. 2+ years of pandemic-induced remote work have only accelerated the trend of New Yorkers, going somewhere else. A more cynical person might think that this has been a strategy all along. Make it uncomfortable for your political foes in New York, and they'll leave, which gives you more power. But it's just not Republicans leaving, despite the governor's command. The New Yorkers from across this political spectrum are united by and running from a common enemy known as the tax man. So this is interesting, right? Because we have this edict from the New York governor, if not an order. Hey, Republicans, leave the state. We don't want you here anyway. All of you, we don't want you here. And then those Republicans, let's just say tomorrow, all of those millions of Republicans left New York State, the state would be in complete disarray, and it would be effectively financially bankrupt. Because you can't support the massive welfare state that New York has created, okay, that Democrats have created in New York. You can't support that massive welfare state without the people who are actually working. And those tend to be, by and large, Republicans. But it does miss the point, ladies and gentlemen, which is Kathy Hochul, the governor of New York, is all about trying to incite, and she is one of those inciters, trying to incite Republicans to basically rebel at the state capitol in Albany and say, enough already. We need relief. We need tax relief. We need you to get off of our backs. We need you to stop trying to demonize the people that are actually paying the bills in New York State. And yet, she doesn't get it, and the Democrats don't get it, that if they were to lose their base of small businesses and taxpayers, they would no longer be able to support that welfare state. And quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, that might be necessary to happen in a place like New York before. And by the way, it would be awful if it happened, but it might actually be what's necessary before people learn. I mean, it's part of the problem, of course, which is a whole other subject about our public education system. How can you not know? How can you not know, if you live in the state of New York, that if you get rid of the people that are paying the bills, you can't have the largesse of government anymore? How can you not know that? But if you are someone who is really an authoritarian at heart, like Governor Kathy Hochul, you don't really care. It's really mainly about political power. And probably what your hope is that you'll be able to be bailed out time and time again by the federal government by getting rid of all the taxpayers in your state and sending them to some other state. And then everybody else in the country will be responsible for bailing you out. And so the thesis of this podcast, we're calling the inciters, the people that are actually the true people who are inciting riots and civil unrest, which I believe in my heart are the Democrat Party, for saying things like this. Get out of our state. We don't want you. We don't want your money. No, your money's bad. We don't want you, the workers. We don't want people working in our state. No, we just want a bunch of people sitting on the couch all the time, smoking pot. because we can control them because they're dependent upon government. So that's Kathy Hochul inciting the Republicans in her state. But then you have Michigan. Did you know dead people can vote in Michigan? So in Michigan, the Secretary of State actually went to court in Michigan to defend the idea of keeping dead people on the voting rolls. So get this. In the Epoch Times, Michigan, and by the way, it's across papers, in papers across the country, not just the Epoch Times. Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson has failed to convince a judge to dismiss a case that could force the state of Michigan to remove almost 26,000 dead people from the voter rolls. Benson, the Secretary of State, moved to dismiss the case brought against her in November of 2021 by the public interest group Legal Foundation, otherwise known as PILF, no, not MILF, PILF, for her failure to clean up the state's voter registration rolls in an alleged violation of Section 8 of the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. On August 25, Benson's motion to dismiss the case was denied, by the way, just a few days ago. On August 25th, the Secretary of State, her name is Benson, her motion to dismiss the case was denied in an order by the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Michigan. The court also denied the motions to intervene filed by the Detroit Downriver chapter of the A. Philip Randolph Institute, the Michigan Alliance for Retired Americans, and RISE, Inc. Additionally, PILF's suit seeks to force Benson to provide documentation of her efforts to remove deceased registrants from voting rolls, something she has thus far failed to do. So what is the takeaway from this, ladies and gentlemen? The takeaway is you have the Secretary of State in Michigan, whose job it is to maintain accurate voter rolls in the state of Michigan. That is her job. She literally went to court to stop the removal of almost 26,000 dead people from the voting. So she wants the dead people to stay on the voting rolls. PILF notified Benson of the problem in September 2020. So the group to remove the deceased voters notified the Secretary of State back in September of 2020. And again in November of 2020, a year before they actually filed the lawsuit. The foundation provided Benson with the names of 25,975 voters who had died but were still on the Michigan voter rolls, as were discovered by its research. Or of those, 23,663 of them had been dead for 5 years or more. So 23,663 registrants had been dead for 5 years or more, and yet they were still on the Michigan rolls. So if you were running for office in the state of Michigan, and you were running for a statewide office, and it was a really close race, you could have literally 23,000 people who had been dead for more than 5 years somehow voting. And how could they vote? Well, they couldn't vote in person. That'd be kind of hard to do, but they could certainly vote via absentee ballot, which is why voting in person is so important, along with voter ID, ladies and gentlemen. And so the takeaway here is, if you are a Republican and you live in the state of Michigan, it would only be natural that you would feel incited to say, well, wait a minute, why isn't our system working? Why isn't our system working to the point that we at least agree as Americans that dead people ought not be voting and dead people ought not be eligible to vote because they're still on the voter rolls? And yet in Michigan, you have a Secretary of State, a far left activist who believes that cheating, legal cheating, if you will, is okay. I mean, this is when you can't have common ground And when you can't find common ground, ladies and gentlemen, that individuals ought not be voting when they're dead, and when you can't find common ground that individuals should always be voting in person with voter ID, unless there is an extreme and unique case where they just cannot get to the polls because of some health issue, then and only then they can vote by absentee ballot. But otherwise, everybody ought to be required to go to the polls in person and vote in person with a voter ID. And here we have a situation in Michigan where the outcome of elections could easily be determined by just the dead people alone. And we know that there's obviously plenty of discussion nationwide and in the Republican Party about why we want voter rolls to be cleaned up, why we want there to be voter ID, why we don't want drop boxes, why we want in-person voting, just kind of common sense things that any normal person would agree to, any American would normally agree to in normal times. And yet we have, on the one hand, the New York governor saying, Republicans, get out of my state, all 3.5 million of you. And on the other hand, we have in Michigan, only dead people can remain on the voting rolls because, we've got 26,000 dead people still on their voting rolls, and we're going to fight to maintain that voter roll base so that they stay on the voter rolls. And by the way, there's another issue there too. And that is when the Bureau of the Census every 10 years counts how many residents there are in your state, you now have 26,000 more people on the voter rolls. So you might be able to maintain an additional congressional representative if that 26,000 number gets you just above the point that you would otherwise need. What does that mean? It means that you're cheating. It means you're cheating because we don't have equal representation, because it's not proportioned properly, because your state is cheating. And then if you try to run in the state, as I said earlier, you could very well lose and likely would lose in Republican. And by the way, if you noticed in Michigan, statewide races are really hard for Republicans to win. Now we know why. This is just one area of cheating, let alone the absentee ballot and drop box nonsense. And so we're calling this podcast Inciters because there is a sense in the United States by the Republicans and conservatives across this country that Democrats, for whatever reason, and I have to probably qualify this with obviously not 100% of Democrats, but it certainly seems like a majority of Democrats think it's okay to keep dead people on the voter rolls, because I haven't heard a single Democrat speak out against that. And Democrats definitely, I will tell you this in my state, it's universal, think that voter ID is wrong. How can voter ID be wrong? And Democrats universally believe that voting should all occur by mail with no voter ID and no verification that you're the person that actually signed the ballot and sent it in, let alone that you were actually breathing. So in other words, there's this feeling in the Republican Party and sense, and these two stories back it up, that so many Democrats across America who are elected, as well as Democrats who aren't elected, think that cheating is okay. That cheating in elections is how it's just supposed to be. And folks, it's not. It's not. I mean, if you have a week of early voting, get your butt to the polls and vote in person like you're supposed to do. And show your voter ID. Be an American. Demonstrate that you care about voting and that you care about the fact that voting is something that you take sacred, and that it is sacred, and that you're voting and you know that your vote will be cast properly because it's really you doing it. And this idea that, I just can't get there in a timely manner, even though I have a week to do it, is nonsense. Is utter nonsense. And so, based on this inciter, I think, language and actions that we're seeing from the Democrat Party, namely that they're trying to incite, the Democrat Party, are trying to incite the Republicans into civil unrest so the Democrats can say, see, those are mega Republicans, or those are the ultra conservatives, and they're out of control and they're unreasonable. Based on all that, we heard the other day Joe Biden say that the MAGA Republicans, are like semi-fascists. So Jean-Pierre, the White House's press secretary, Biden's press secretary, she's in the White House, and she's probably the single dumbest press secretary ever to have served in the White House. Jean-Pierre, but of course she's got all the right qualifications, Jean-Pierre is in the White House, and she's asked this very question. Namely, do you think it's okay for the President of the United States to call MAGA Republicans, let alone Republicans in general, semi-fascists? And keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that when the president does this, you have in the background the New York governor calling for Republicans to leave the state. So she's calling for an exodus. And we have the Michigan Secretary of State keeping dead people on the rolls so they can continue to vote. So Jean-Pierre has asked this question. We have that clip, and here it is.
So two questions.
Sure.
On the semi-fascism comment.
Yeah.
Is this something we're going to hear more of, that phrase? Is it something the president's going to kind of embrace? Or is there any sense that it was, a little impromptu, and it's going to turn into a kind of basket of deplorables thing that he regrets and tries to be quiet about?
Look, I was very clear when laying out and defining what MAGA Republicans have done, and you look at the definition of fascism, and you think about what they're doing in attacking our democracy, what they're doing in taking away our freedoms, wanting to take away our rights, our voting rights. I mean, that is what that is. It is very clear, and that's why he made that powerful speech that you heard from him last night. And he has not shied away from saying that. You have heard him maybe not use that specific word, but you have heard him certainly use that definition. And look, what we are putting before the American people is a choice, right? And it is clear, there's a clear contrast as what is happening on that side of the aisle and what's happening on our side with congressional Democrats and what we have been delivering for the American people. And we're going to continue to fight for freedom. We're going to continue to fight for people's rights. And that is something that he takes.
So that's Jean-Pierre talking about Republicans being MAGA fascists or semi-fascists, so Republicans in general. And she's saying, and that's because that Republicans are trying to take away your right to vote. So that just happened, ladies and gentlemen, that press conference with Jean-Pierre at the White House. And then at the same time, in the background, what just happened is the New York governor calls for a Republican purge to tell Republicans that they must engage in the largest exodus in American history simply because of their party affiliation. And in the background, the Michigan Secretary of State, with a completely silent Democrat electorate, all elected Democrats in the state of Michigan, they all agreed with this because not one spoke out. In Michigan, you have the Secretary of State saying 26,000 dead people must remain on the voting rolls in Michigan. And then you have Jean-Pierre saying Republicans are semi-fascists because they're trying to take away your voting rights. So we're calling this podcast Inciters because I believe, and I believe for some time, that the Democrat Party is trying to incite Republicans to riot and to engage in civil unrest. And they're trying to do that by doing exactly what they're claiming Republicans are doing, which, let's face it, Republicans are not trying to take away your voting rights by saying, show your voter ID and vote in person. It's the opposite. They're trying to restore your confidence in voting. And so you have Jean-Pierre say that, and it's based on Biden's absurd speech in Maryland where he says, the MAGA Republicans are like fascists, which we have that clip just to remind you, and here it is.
The MAGA Republicans don't just threaten our personal rights and economic security. They're a threat to our very democracy. They refuse to accept the will of the people. They embrace political violence. They don't believe in democracy. This is why, in this moment, those of you who love this country, Democrats, independents, mainstream Republicans, we must be stronger, more determined, and more committed to saving America than the MAGA Republicans are destroying America.
Yeah, so there you go. You got Biden again saying pretty much the same thing as Jean-Pierre, namely that we have Republicans that don't believe in America, so they're trying to undermine elections. And then you have the New York governor trying to undermine all future elections by purging Republicans. And in Michigan, you have the Democrat Party trying to keep dead people on the voting rolls. And then, of course, if that weren't enough, to incite Republicans, okay, if that weren't enough, then you have the FBI, of course, having at least one individual, it might be two, I've heard different stories, but certainly one at a minimum, who decided to resign or retire, I'm not sure which, because he actually decided to not investigate the Hunter Biden laptop. So a senior FBI official has abruptly resigned, the Washington Times reported yesterday, amidst allegations that the FBI agent showed improper political bias during the Bureau's investigation into information recovered from the hard drive of a laptop left by Hunter Biden in a Delaware computer repair shop. Timothy Thibault, an assistant special agent in charge in the FBI's Washington field office, was forced to leave his post, the paper reported, in an exclusive saying two former Bureau officials familiar with the situation had provided the information and description of his departure. Citing eyewitnesses and eyewitness accounts provided by one of them, Thibault was escorted from the building by 2 or 3 headquarters-looking type FBI agents, wrote the reporters who broke the story. Quote, it's not clear whether Thibault left on his own accord or was forced out of the Bureau. So look, folks, it's not certain whether he left and resigned on his own or whether he had a discussion with his superiors and they said, you must resign and you got to get out of the building immediately. But here's the thing. What we do know now is the FBI, okay, and to be fair, the FBI is made up of thousands of agents and it only takes a few bad ones, okay? But they always seem to be, the bad ones always seem to be the ones in charge at the top of the FBI or in positions of authority. It certainly seems that way. What we know is that there are a group of people in the FBI who covered up this Hunter Biden laptop and engaged in a cover-up so massive that it resulted in, without question, getting Joe Biden elected. Because had the information been out there about Joe Biden's son and Joe Biden's involvement, at least according to his son's laptop, in shady dealings in the Ukraine and in China and who knows where else, I don't think Joe Biden would be president. And so you have to ask yourself the question, doesn't this story coming out so long after the 2020 election, doesn't that incite Republicans as well? And yet you have Joe Biden saying the MAGA Republicans are fascists because they don't believe in democracy. Really? Maybe they don't believe in fairness in our elections. I think that that's probably pretty accurate. And maybe they don't believe in the fairness of our elections because of stories like that, where you have an FBI agent who is escorted out of the building, escorted out, right? So you know it must be really bad what the FBI actually knows. Escorted out of the building because that FBI agent was engaged in a complete and utter cover-up of the Hunter Biden laptop by saying it's Russian disinformation. So what the hell's on the laptop then? What is on it? Why don't we still know? We get little bits and pieces, but what's on it? Who's involved? How did Hunter and Joe Biden make all this money? And how did Joe Biden's, brother make all this money? These are all reasonable questions to ask. And it goes to the thesis of the podcast that the Democrats are trying to incite civil disobedience and civil unrest in the United States of America by Republicans by saying Republicans are semi-fascist because they don't believe in American elections. And meanwhile, got the Democrats saying, keep the dead people on the rolls, by the way. Don't take them off. And, oh, by the way, get rid of all the Republicans out of our state. Among many other things. And by the way, in my state, it's just as bad. In my state, if you are a voter, okay, you can request an absentee ballot for any reason and for no reason, and then you can fill out that absentee ballot, and then you can put it into a drop box. So who the heck knows who voted for you? Right? No one knows. Nobody knows. And in my own household, ladies and gentlemen, in my household, because of that absentee ballot nonsense, I routinely still get absentee ballots or requests for absentee ballots at a minimum for my children who haven't lived home for years. So I could pretty easily vote for them too, right? Because since I don't have to vote in person, I have the absentee ballot, this piece of paper. I vote the way I want to vote for, let's say, 3 people, myself and 2 other people. And then I take it to a drop box and no one is the wiser. And that is why voting in person and voting with a voter ID is so important. And it's perfectly reasonable for Republicans nationwide to believe that we have a fundamental problem with election integrity in America when that kind of nonsense is allowed, and it's allowed in my own state. And then we have the Democrats at the national level at the beginning of this year trying to pass a bill that reforms elections at the federal level. And part of the reform was to prohibit the use of voter ID and to promote and to provide funding to states so that they could have what? Massive absentee ballot type elections, which encourages cheating. Do you know in Western Europe, most of the countries don't even allow this being absentee ballots and drop boxes because they realize it encourages cheating, and that actually was their experience with such voting. So if you're a Republican in the United States, you have the president of the United States saying, you know what, you're just extreme. You're an extremist. And, we think that you don't believe in elections and you're the real danger to America. And meanwhile, you see, of course, Antifa rioting in the streets. You see in the inner cities in America, you see rampant crime, and you see carjackings and people just going in and out of jail, no matter how violent they are. It's just like a revolving door coming right back out. And you say to yourself, well, how else do I get people to listen? Well, in the past, it was always I would go to vote. And that's how I got people to listen, because my vote would matter and most reasonable people would go to vote, and you would have that change occur at the ballot box, which is the peaceful way to do it and the right way to do it, except when you have a Democrat Party who's trying to cheat at the ballot box and is being effective in doing so. And I know this in my own state. Okay? Because in my own state, if I'm getting 3 ballots or 3 requests for ballots in my own mailing box, 2 of whom are from my children, obviously there's cheating that's occurring. It's pretty easy to do. So as a result of the FBI's, and again, who knows how many people were involved at the very top of the FBI in this cover-up of the Hunter Biden laptop, not to mention the FBI going to Mark Zuckerberg and telling Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, hey, you know what you need to do? You need to tamp down, any kind of MAGA conversation on Facebook. And you need to make sure that the Hunter Biden laptop thing is also kind of tamped down a lot too, because it's technically Russian disinformation. The FBI, the Stasi of our country in the modern era, has decided that they put their finger on the scale of elections, and they tip the election in Joe Biden's favor. And then we have Joe Biden saying it's the MAGA Republicans who are the danger to the United States of America. And then, of course, in perfect timing, not to waste 1 minute, Donald Trump does what? He says, you know what, based on the FBI's information alone, based on the fact that we now know that the FBI was truly engaged, because now they're admitting it, that they were engaged in this big cover-up. Now that we know, Trump's saying, I want a redo of the 2020 election immediately. So he's saying, as a result of the revelations, we need to have a new election. And then what does that do? Causes the Democrats to say, well, it's because the Republicans don't believe in elections. But why can't we actually have a conversation and say, well, maybe there's actually stuff that's out there, such as the FBI, a federal agency that is actually trying to engage in systematic cover-up for a major candidate running for president of the United States? Of course, there's a question about the 2020 election. Okay? Was there enough going on in the 2020 election to have determined the outcome? There's no way of knowing. But what we do know is there's a lot, because it's coming out little by little. And if that wasn't enough, as I said earlier, you got the Michigan Secretary of State trying to keep dead people on the voter rolls. Why? And then in New York, you're trying to get rid of all the Republicans to leave the state. Why? It's always about money. Always. It's always about control, power, and money. Always. So you had this almost impossible situation, to which I always say it's so important to go back to the central point of this podcast. We are going to continue to have more incitement by the inciters, the Democrat Party, until such time as we get reasonable people in office and reasonable people voting for those people in office to finally require people to vote in person with an ID. Because you can't cheat that. You can't. It's impossible. You know that is the person. They have an ID because it's a real ID, number one. Number two, they have an address on it. Number three, you have them in their voting system. They're voting in person. They're showing up to you. You see them. There they are. Proves it. Boom. Vote. This would solve the problem. Okay? However, it's not going to solve the problem of crooked federal agencies that are actually engaging in cover-ups and trying to influence, and probably very much and very effectively influence, the outcome of an election, which is what the FBI did. And that is what many Republicans believe. You don't even have to be a MAGA Republican, ladies and gentlemen, to believe this. There are plenty of Republicans that believe this because of the fact that they don't trust mail-in elections, which is what 2020 was. It was a mail-in election. And you have Democrats trying to expand mail-in elections and trying to separate the voter as far as they can from the verification that the voter actually casts the ballot, as I've said ad nauseum. And so we know that the Democrats are doing everything they can to incite Republican violence, potentially, or civil unrest. I think that's probably the correct term, civil unrest. And you know what? Senator Lindsey Graham said the same thing. And we have a clip of this. And this has to do with the raid of Mar-a-Lago. Okay, so once again, you got a former president of the United States. You have the FBI, who put their finger on the scale of that election, said that Trump was a Russian spy or part of Russian information. He was even impeached accordingly, which of course we now know isn't true. So if you're a Trump supporter, then you probably already don't trust the system. And now, of course, you have the FBI that raided, the same FBI that cheated in the 2020 election and put their finger on the scale, raids the Trump residence in Mar-a-Lago. And now you have Lindsey Graham saying this. We have the clip, and here it is.
Say this. If there's a prosecution of Donald Trump for mishandling classified information after the Clinton debacle, which you presided over and did a hell of a good job, there'll be riots in the streets.
That is Lindsey Graham saying exactly what the very thesis is of this podcast. The Democrats are intent, and the federal agencies that have been weaponized are working together to incite Republican disobedience and civil disobedience. That's what the Democrat Party is doing. And it's trying to do it to demonstrate that, oh, no, it's really the Republicans that are the danger to democracy. And so that's why I go back to the same issue again and again, which is we have to have people vote in person, because I'm convinced that that would solve so many of our nation's problems, number one. And number two, we have to have massive reforms with the FBI and probably every other federal agency for that reason. And then the question is, well, how do you do that, right? How do you reform the FBI? And Victor David Hansen has actually said you reform them by breaking them up. And by breaking them up, he doesn't mean destroying the FBI and just, having everybody resign and then start all over again. He means breaking up the agency into specific departments, and the departments are not under one roof and they're completely separated. And then you reform those departments one at a time and see which departments are really required and necessary and who's heading them. And maybe another answer too is you don't have the same person ahead of those departments for very long. So I'm sure that's a discussion for another time. Nonetheless, it's worth talking about, because the Democrats are going to continue to use these federal agencies to do everything they can to put their finger on the scale. So next up, podcast listeners, Rhino, Maryland governor kisses up to CBS on Face the Nation. So CBS has that long-running news program. They call it a hard news program on Sunday mornings called Face the Nation. It's kind of a joke. And Rhino Governor Larry Hogan gets on it. And Governor Larry Hogan, of course, is a Republican in the very left-wing state of Maryland. But the governor decides to do exactly what the Democrats are doing, which is to say, and to agree with President Biden and Jean-Pierre that the MAGA Republicans are the problem. It's just the most incredible thing that I have ever seen. And what this takeaway is for you folks out there in podcast land nationwide is when you have someone who decides to sell out their party, and they sell out their party on the lowest common denominator, namely saying that there aren't improvements that we can make to the election system. Meanwhile, here's the guy who is the governor of Maryland, where massive election issues continue to occur in the city of Baltimore. And the Democrats are doing everything they can to undermine Maryland's election system by eliminating voter ID and eliminating in-person voting. So first up, here is Governor Larry Hogan on Face the Nation. Here's the clip.
Real quickly, do you see any strains of authoritarianism in the Republican Party?
Well, there's no question we see some signs of that, and I've been one of the ones speaking out.
Very good. Governor Hogan, thanks so much.
So do you see authoritarianism in the Republican Party? So why does that matter? Why are we telling you this? Because naturally, CBS News is a very left-wing news show, of course, always has been, like all of CBS and NBC and ABC and all of them. And they have to get on a Republican who is going to tell them exactly what they want to hear. And Larry Hogan is all too happy to tell them exactly what they want to hear, which is, oh, yeah, the Republican Party has lots of authoritarian people in. Not Kathy Hochul of New York. Oh, no. Not the Secretary of State of Michigan. Oh, no. No, not the FBI. Oh, no. Not even the Democrat Party, which is the party that's trying to get rid of voter ID. Oh, no. It is the Republicans. So you have a Republican throwing the Republicans under the bus, not even trying to talk about the much broader and more important issues that we've been talking about this podcast. So Rhino Governor Larry Hogan decides to do what? He decides to incite Republicans himself by calling them authoritarian. And so then, naturally, as CBS always does, and all of the mainstream media always does, it says, well, Governor Hogan, what happened to the guy that was, you had somebody that was going to run and take your place in Maryland now that you're actually in the last few months of your term as governor of Maryland and you're termed out, why didn't your chosen successor win? Listen to what Hogan does. And this is what happens when a rhino is in office, because they don't believe in anything. They just believe in power and staying in power. They don't actually have a core of values that they believe in. They're valueless. Just about money, just about power, just about staying elected. We have that clip, and here it is.
How either alarming or maybe giving you a moment for pause was it to see your preferred Republican gubernatorial candidate, Kelly Schultz, lose in a Republican primary for governor in your own state of Maryland?
Well, it was really
what does that tell you?
It was really sad, and it's what I've been talking about for 2 years, that, this should be a really huge year for Republicans just because of the failures of the Democrats and who are in control of everything and Biden's low approval ratings. But we could blow it by nominating unelectable people, and that's exactly what's happening across the country and why the wave is going to be more of a ripple rather than a tidal wave.
You called the winner in that Republican gubernatorial primary, Dan Cox, a QAnon whack job and a nut. I take it you're endorsing the Democratic nominee, Wes Moore.
No, I'm not endorsing
Why not?
anybody in the race, but what I'm doing is helping.
But you're bashing on the Republican nominee. Isn't it the same
I've
thing?
just told the truth. When people ask me a question, I usually give them a direct answer, and I, made it very clear that this guy should not be the nominee and he shouldn't be governor. But I'm not getting involved in endorsing in the race.
Yeah, so, Governor, you will not be the presidential nominee for the Republican Party either, just so you know. But, of course, Governor Hogan's asked the question, well, wait a minute, the guy that, won the primary in Maryland for governor that's going to kind of, potentially take your place, you didn't endorse him. In fact, you did worse. You called him a QAnon guy, a QAnon supporter. And doesn't that actually make it almost certain the Democrat's going to win for governor? And by Democrat in Maryland, we're talking about a socialist and a Marxist. And Hogan, the rhino, is like, oh, well, I just call them the way I see them. Meaning that he's okay with a Marxist getting control of the governorship in the state of Maryland. That's more important to him because he wants to be liked by CBS News and he wants to be liked by the Biden administration, who is saying that MAGA Republicans are semi-fascists, and the governor is saying the same thing without actually talking about the specific issues. Talk about the issues, about voter ID, about voting in person, about election integrity, about maintaining and bringing us together so that we have confidence in our elections, about the actual policy issues. Oh, no, he'd much rather have a Marxist in office because, Marxists aren't authoritarian, are they? So then we have another clip, because we have two more clips on this Larry Hogan thing, because it's just important. It just goes to show you how in this country we have certain individuals who are just about getting elected. They don't really believe in anything. And so I hear this often from Republicans too. I'm just tired of those Republicans, they say, who just want to get elected and don't really have a core belief of anything. It's just about that. It's just about getting paid, getting elected, being in charge and acting important. We have another clip. Here it is.
It's why Mitch McConnell is saying we may not win the Senate. It's why we were hoping to pick up seats in governor's races, and now we're not. It's why the margin in the House is so much smaller.
Mm-hmm. It's curious to me, though, Governor. I mean, you won election and then you won re-election with a good number of Democrats in a blue state supporting you. They look to you in this question. You're going to sit out and not tell them
well,
who you think the next governor of Maryland should be?
I think they already have their mind made up. But yes, Maryland's only got 23% Republican. And I had to win, almost all the Republicans and independents and 25% of the Democrats to win. But this candidate is not going to do that.
So we have the governor of Maryland, the sitting governor of Maryland, Rhino Larry Hogan, saying, well, Marylanders have already made up their mind. They've already made up their mind, meaning that Governor Hogan isn't going to try to help the Republican nominee at all. In fact, he's going to do everything he can to hose his campaign because as far as the Rhino Republican governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, is concerned, the state's already made up its mind. It's going to elect Wes Moore, the Marxist, because a Marxist is so much better. And then we have the final clip in this series with Face the Nation on CBS with Rhino Governor Larry Hogan. And this is the funniest part, ladies and gentlemen. Remember, this is the governor of Maryland. He's a Republican. At least he'd like you to think that he is. But you heard all of his comments there. Listen to this. He says he's going to Is he going to run for president? He thinks he's going to run for president. Believe me, he does. We have the clip, and here it is.
View it differently.
As I understand your travel schedule, Governor, you're heading to New Hampshire again. You've been there before. You've been to Iowa. When are you announcing your 2024 bid?
Well, maybe this morning. No, I'm just teasing.
Go right ahead, Governor.
So there you have the governor of Maryland going, real smug. Yeah, I went to New Hampshire and I went to Iowa. Yeah, I might run for president. I mean, here's a guy. It's always about him, right? It's always about him and whether or not he gets to stay in office and whether or not he's liked by everybody. That's the most important thing. Not about what is correct, not about what is good policy, not about any of those things. It's always about him and getting to the next office and staying in office and so forth. And he is literally, Larry Hogan is literally the definition of the uniparty in the United States of America, which is exactly what gave birth to the Tea Party, ladies and gentlemen. It's exactly what gave birth to the MAGA Republicans. The fact that there is this sense in the heart of the United States that we have a uniparty. That is to say, we don't really have two parties that are running the country and through their adverse kind of debate and so forth and debating through issues, come up with policy and compromise. No, we don't have that as far as the Tea Party and MAGA Republicans believe. Instead, what we have are the Larry Hogans of the world, which are the uniparty. It's just about keeping the right people in power, in the right jobs, and making sure the deep state still stays in control, and making sure that the people really don't have free and fair elections, and that we don't try to make the elections more and more secure so that we have confidence in those elections. Oh no, Larry Hogan's all too fine with throwing the other Republican under the bus who's running for governor of Maryland, or any other Republican for that matter, because it's all about him. And even if that means a Marxist gets elected, that's okay. That's okay, because the Marxist in Larry's mind isn't the authoritarian guy. It's the Republican who's the authoritarian guy. And that's Rhino Maryland governor kisses up to CBS. So next up, podcast listeners, we have just an interesting issue here to talk to you about. It's the local Antifa group shows up armed, as in with guns, to protect grown men dancing provocatively for children. So you heard that correctly. So Antifa is trying to protect trans groomers. Yes. So you want to know why I believe, and we'll leave you with this, that the left is trying to incite Republicans that they call MAGA Republicans who are semi-fascists to engage in civil unrest, because the left is doing everything it can to undermine every common decency that we have in this country, everything that we believe and hold sacred, namely our children, among many other things. So in the Daily Caller, get this. Some members of the far-left group Antifa showed up Sunday to protect a drag queen event where minors were present. Andarin Distillery and Grill in Roanoke, Texas held a Barrel Babes brunch featuring 4 different drag queens. Protect Texas Kids, which arranged a counter-protest to the event, said it confirmed the children were allowed to be in attendance at the event. Yeah, because, that's what I always wanted, right, is to have my kids go to that event, not. Join us for Barrel for Babes, a special brunch Sunday, August 28th, with a fun show starting at 1 p.m. Yeah, a fun show, where kindness and inclusion meets fabulous fun. The event is hosted by Trisha Delish. That's the name. Obviously a drag queen. Trisha Delish. Yeah, so would you really want your 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old being entertained by Trisha Delish? Hey, Mom, I'm going over to Trisha Delish's house tonight. Is cover free and will feature 3 other queens from Dallas. And so then we have footage of these men dancing provocatively with the children. And then what's happening? Well, Andy No says today a group of armed Antifa members came to Roanoke, Texas to support a drag queen event. The local chapter of the John Brown Gun Club, an Antifa militia linked to domestic terrorism, led to call to direct action. It is headed by Christopher Gillett and Garrett Lee. So that's from Andy No. He tweeted that out. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave you with this. This podcast is called Inciters. The Democrats are the inciters. they're doing these crazy things through Antifa and through all of their other revolutionaries to try to undermine, in my opinion, America's democracy by making it impossible to trust elections, by not having voter ID, among many other things, by weaponizing the deep state, the IRS, the FBI, and then, of course, by looking the other way when Antifa protects with guns a club that has Trisha Delish and other drag queens dancing for children and thinking that is okay. And that's it for Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Getter, Truth Social, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.